This is a boy of 19, a dreamy, sensitive individual, interested particularly in the current musical idiom of bebop. He heard voices accusing him of abnormal sexual practices and believed he was the second coming of Christ. Transorbital lobotomy was performed on August 1st. This photograph shows the leucotome at a depth of 7 centimeters from the upper eyelid, parallel with the nose. Now the handle of the instrument is elevated, making the deep frontal cut.
What they were saying was homosexuality is a mental disease. Homosexuality is a pervasive emotional disorder. It is psychopathological. Now, what makes it psychopathological? In their view, what makes it psychopathological is that two people of the same sex love each other.
Rick? You had a transorbital lobotomy on August 1st. Do you know what day it is today?
It's August 9th.
That's right. Why did you have that operation, do you know?
I think it was something to do with my sexual intercourse.
Mm-hmm. Was that seriously in error?
Well, I thought it was, anyhow. No, I didn't either. I just finished reading the Kinsey report.
When you're as long as I am, there.
There you go.
Yes. There I
Now we're
go.
gonna go around.
This
go around
way?
This way.
This way?
Yeah.
This is Dr. Evelyn Hooker, now 84 years old. When she began her psychological research on gay men in the 1940s, homosexuality was regarded as a mental illness.
That is the little house. It was a little guest house in which the research began. That little house.
Evelyn Gentry was born on September 2nd, 1907. She spent her early years with 8 brothers and sisters in a one-room farmhouse on the Colorado Plains. When Evelyn was 13, her family moved to the little town of Sterling, Colorado.
Growing up for me was a very painful process. We were very much aware that we lived on the other side of the railroad tracks. I was very tall when I was an adolescent, almost 6 feet, and girls at that time, especially in a small high school, were not favored, let us say.
In 1924, 17-year-old Evelyn began to work her way through the University of Colorado.
I went to Boulder, and I worked taking care of a family, cleaning house, cooking. So it was the only thing I knew how to do.
Evelyn was drawn to psychology, a relatively new scientific field, which in the 1920s was dominated by behaviorism, the study of stimulus and response in animals. Guided by her mentor, Dr. Carl Munzinger, Evelyn early on challenged the conventions of behaviorism by attempting to prove there was mental mediation between stimulus and response.
Under his direction in a course in abnormal psychology, he suggested to me, which was most unusual, I think, he suggested, why don't you, Evelyn, write your own case history? The more I began to get into it, the more I realized it became a challenge not only to my own understanding of myself, but also that as a science, that this was, in a sense, a new and budding science, and that therefore the challenge could be really very considerable.
After she received her master's degree from Colorado, Evelyn became one of 11 women enrolled in the PhD program in psychology at Johns Hopkins University.
I wanted to go to Yale, but no. The chairman of the department, not Dr. Mincer, the chairman of the department decided that he could not refer a woman to go to Yale. He himself was from Yale, and he had studied why raccoons wash their food. I think the only thing he discovered was to get it clean. In any event, so he said no, he couldn't do that. I go to Hopkins, and then I'm terribly glad. It turns out to be my kind of place.
Evelyn was awarded her PhD in 1932, but after teaching a year at the Maryland College for Women, she contracted tuberculosis and spent the next year in an Arizona sanatorium.
What I learned was that I was not absolutely indomitable. I could be struck down by one physical ailment or another, and I had them, but that I had an enormous powers of recovery.
In 1937, recovered from TB, Evelyn received a fellowship to travel and study in Europe. Curious about the political climate of Nazi Germany, she elected to spend it at the Berlin Institute for Psychotherapy, where she enrolled with her friend, Lucy Nixon.
I stood below the Reichschancellery in Berlin and saw and heard Hitler come home from taking Austria over. Everybody was out in the street. We used to refer to these as organized, spontaneous enthusiasm. You had to be out. If you were found inside when the order came, if you were found inside, they shot you. So we heard. Anyway, Lucy and I arrived down in front of the Reichschancellor, and their propaganda machine is so terrible, so efficiently terrible, that they were whipping up the frenzy of the crowd. Der Führer is near, the Führer is near, and all of a sudden, the tension is just terrible. People are roaring, and all of a sudden, they announce that the Führer is at the Bahnhof and that he will be here any minute. And that when he stepped out on that balcony, every arm shot up like that. Guess what happened? Right arm. Guess what happens? Lucy's arm went, my friend. She's a Quaker. She's a pacifist. And her arm, I say, Lucy, what do you think you're doing? Incredible manipulation of people.
On the eve of Kristallnacht, Evelyn chose to board with a Jewish family.
The younger daughter, she was an unhappy child. And I could hear her begging her parents at night to let her become Protestant, not to be Jewish. And I can't imagine a more difficult thing to explain to a child than why you can't stop being Jewish.
Sigmund Freud, who fled to England at about the time Evelyn arrived in Germany, was an early proponent of the belief that homosexuality was not a mental illness. Freud rejected the idea that homosexuality could or should be cured by psychoanalysis. Despite Freud, the medical profession continued to insist that homosexuality was a sickness and that homosexual people were ill.
It's odd. It's very odd. When I think about what I must have been teaching when I began to see the light with Sammy and his friends, I'm appalled because I must have been teaching this all the old stuff about emotional disorder and so on and so on and so on, because that's where it was in textbooks everywhere.
The belief that homosexual men and women could be cured exposed them to the very latest in medical technology.
No,
We'll help you to get well.
nothing will help me to get well.
Ready?
These are some of the methods doctors employed to cure homosexuality. Electroconvulsive therapy, or shock. Hysterectomies on lesbians. And in the case of Doctors Sand and Ockles, over 100 castrations of gay men. To make them more feminine, lesbians were injected with the female hormone estrogen, despite which they remained lesbians. Homosexual men were also injected with estrogen. They grew breasts and lost their sex drive, but not their attraction to men.
Gotta get off.
I had a dear friend. Well, when he had been about 18 or 19, he was an undergraduate at the university. He was gay, and so he went to the Student Health Service and told them that he was gay and could they do anything about it. So the doctors at the health service decided that what he should have would be some massive doses of testosterone, and that this would perhaps transform him into a healthy heterosexual. And so they proceeded to give him these massive doses over a period of days or weeks, I don't know. And he said that hair appeared all over his body, which he never had before. He suddenly had a very heavy beard. And his sexual desire was just increased many, many fold. Instead of having sex once or twice a week, he was having it 4 or 5 times a day. But his direction of his sexual interest never altered.
In 1941, America changed nearly overnight. Millions of people were drafted into the armed forces. And millions more were pulled into the cities to do war work. Formerly isolated, gay men and women began to find one another and form social networks. An underground culture flourished in the climate of the new urbanism. In 1942, while teaching at UCLA, Evelyn married writer Don Caldwell.
I love the whole process of teaching, arousing the interest of students, getting them to be excited. As far as I'm concerned, there's nothing in the world like it. Nothing. I was teaching an introductory class at UCLA, and Sam Fromm registered for it. He was fragile in build, short. Within 2 sessions of the class, I knew that he was the brightest person in the class, absolutely. He very quickly would come to talk with me after class was over and discovered that I was not driving my car in order to save gasoline. He would drive me home. After he was out of my class, he called and wanted to come by. When he left, my husband turned to me and said, "You told me everything else about him. Why didn't you tell me?" And I suppose he said, because of the time, "Why didn't you tell me he was queer?" My mouth dropped open. I looked at him and said, "How could you possibly know that? I think you're crazy. How could you possibly know that in this brief period of time?" He said, "Well, he did everything but fly out the window."
In 1943, Sam Fromm introduced Evelyn into his circle of gay friends, where she discovered a new world.
There was Benton Way. Benton Way as this rambling old house on Benton Street. When you were there, whether you were gay or a straight person who at that time they said was in the know, myself, for example, I was wise. If I knew about homosexuality and accepted it, then it's safe to say whatever you want to say in front of that person. The members who lived there felt very secure. Is that our place?
Any of this look familiar to you?
Well, a lot of renovation can do anything. There was this lively circle of friends, and in that group there were philosophers, poets, engineers, you name it, they had it. We talked about literature, including plays. We talked about art, music, because there were always some musicians in that group. My goodness, what an historic place. To think the first time Sam came to my class, he came home and called the people in his house and said, she's another, you know what? She's
Another what?
She's another Eleanor Roosevelt. You've got
There
to
you
meet
go.
her. So they did, and we did. You know, it was marvelous.
Yeah.
Yes, it was, they had a wonderful time here.
You have fond memories?
Very fond memories. On a Thanksgiving holiday, Don and I went with Sam and George to San Francisco, just on a holiday. We went one night to, Sammy insisted that we should see Finocchio's. Unbelievable. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. I just thought it was the most craziest place you could imagine. And we came back to the Fairmount and decided to have some coffee or something before we went to bed. And at that moment, Sam turned to me and said, "Now, Evelyn, it is your scientific duty to study people like us." He said, "We have let you see us as we are, and people don't know what we are, really, and it's your duty to study people like us." To which I replied, well, I couldn't do that because you are my friends. I couldn't be objective about you. He said we'll get a whole new group. We can get as many as 100 gay guys to come if you want, and so on and so on. So we let the matter drop. And when we came back to Los Angeles, and Sam just wouldn't let me go, that is to say, he would call, periodically he would call me and to see what I was doing about it. And finally, I went to Bruno Klopfer, my dear friend with whom I shared an office, and Bruno said, "No, he's right. We don't know anything about men like him, and he's absolutely right. You should do it."
Evelyn began to study her gay friends, a group of well-adjusted men who had never sought nor received psychiatric attention. This was the first time gay people had ever been studied outside a medical or prison setting. When the war ended in 1945, America's political and social climate shifted once again. Women were expected to relinquish war jobs and become mothers. Men were expected to marry and become breadwinners. The emergent ideal of the nuclear family moved gay men and lesbians further away from mainstream American society.
Our enemies are largely within ourselves. Indifference, passiveness, a lack of standards and values about right and wrong, good and bad. Though these things are often excused as universal or even extolled as virtues, broad-mindedness, tolerance, or sophistication, they can be as deadly and destroy us just as surely as any nuclear device or missile or other hardware. They constitute the true fallout, the moral fallout, against which free men must forever give battle if our freedom and its manifold blessings are to endure.
In 1948, Alfred Kinsey published his monumental study attempting to quantify sexual behavior in men. Kinsey found a much higher incidence of homosexual activity than had previously been assumed. Certain leaders saw these statistics as an opportunity to inflame fears and advance political agendas, and in the gay baiting hysteria that followed, hundreds of people were labeled perverts and security risks and driven from their jobs in government. Men and women who had fought bravely in the war suddenly found themselves accused of perversion and dishonorably discharged from the services.
And we had one young man in our outfit, And he had some type of relationship with a young man, young Englishman. This was in England. And he was sentenced to 6 years in prison.
The idea of being different got all mixed up in people's minds, especially people who were not very well educated or socially conscious. Different immediately translated to communist.
Slander, accusation, without being confronted by one's accusers, was simply rife.
In a matter of days, the hysteria could engulf an entire city.
But you had to be very careful if you touched somebody and put your hand on somebody's knee or did anything that looked like an overt, like making a pass.
Most homosexuals do not consider themselves ill, and they are able to live with their condition fairly comfortably. On the other hand, there are those whose behavior becomes a problem for the police. This is an example. This 19-year-old serviceman left his girlfriend on the beach to go to a men's room in a park nearby where he knew that he could find a homosexual contact. The men's room was under police surveillance. The only faces you will see are those of the arresting officers.
Is anybody going to hear about this, like my parents?
Your parents won't know of this, but your company commander will.
Oh, God. I can get kicked out for that.
You could, yes.
But I couldn't take a record like that.
Don't you realize that you guys are in a public park?
But the thing is that for life I'll be wrecked by this record, see? And this will ruin me. I couldn't take for anybody to know about this. I mean, what it'd do to my family and everything. I'm only 19.
Well, why didn't you think of this before you did it?
It's something that just happened. I don't know. I can't explain it. But I'm just 19. I mean, I don't know. I just know this is going to ruin me for life.
Most of the cases I took were gay cases. Quite a few people were arrested in gay bars, and we did the best we could in those type of cases, because one of the worst things was that if you're convicted, you have to register under Section 290 of the Penal Code as a sex offender.
Quite without announcement or anything, the police would come in and start waving their nightclubs around and hitting people here and there, for doing nothing. And then round everybody up and take them down in the paddy wagon.
The fact that homosexuality at that time was considered triply as dangerous to the body and the soul, so to speak. Namely, that it was considered a crime by the police. It was considered a mental or emotional disease by psychiatrists, and it was considered a sin by the religious groups.
I even had one case of a man who wanted a cosmetology license as a hairdresser, and they were trying to get him from getting one because he had been convicted of lewd conduct. He was gay, admittedly gay. But I was able to get him the license because I pointed out to the administrative law judge that I'm sure his wife would never get her hair done if all of the gay cosmetologists were denied licenses.
But I gave a party once that was raided, and the very idea that you couldn't have a party. I mean, other people give parties all the time, don't get raided. But because we were men dancing together.
In spite of an increasingly hostile society, gay life continued to thrive at private clubs, bars, homes, and the beaches.
I was becoming increasingly convinced that there was a number of these men who appeared to me extraordinarily well adjusted. I was prepared, if I could give them adequate psychological tests, to see that they weren't as well adjusted as they appeared to be on the surface. The people who were uttering these statements in books and other places about gay men, I didn't put too much credence to that because I saw that nobody had really studied it. But to go against the prevailing viewpoint, I didn't have any problem about that. I suppose I didn't have any problem about that because very early on I learned that the world of factual discovery, empirical factual discovery, is constantly being remade, changed. So what it's called this year, evil and whatever, next year may constitute the blessing of the human race.
A divorce from Don Caldwell temporarily interrupted Evelyn's work. Needing a place to stay, she looked at a guest cottage at the Saltaire Avenue home of Edward Hooker, distinguished poetry scholar and professor of English at UCLA.
But I'd heard about this man all those years. He walked out of the bedroom and came over and shook my hand and said, "I'm Edward Hooker, and I think it's time we met." Well, that proved to be absolutely correct.
Evelyn rented the cottage on Saltaire Avenue.
We were in the midst of the 1949 University of California loyalty oath. Everyone was very active in working against that oath, and so was I in different circles. So I used to stop at night to talk with him about what they were doing. One night, I said to Edward that I was going up the coast for a few days on a holiday, and wouldn't he like to come? And he said no. Regretfully, he couldn't afford to go. And 3 days later, he came and said, joyfully, "Yes, I can go, because," he said, I forgot about that little sum of money I put away in case my hearing aid goes bad." Now, you would think that when someone says that to you and says, "I can take the money that I need for the most essential equipment in my life and go with you," not a dimwit me, no, nothing. Nothing. So we drove up the coast and we went to Cambria Pines, which is forever enshrined in that's one of my good places. And by that time, I had a suspicion that while I was not really very forthcoming in about Edward was. And so one day I was taking a nap, and Edward was sitting in a chair by the window, reading. I looked at him, and I saw that all the lines of depression and anxiety were just gone, and I knew I loved him. And that was really the beginning of the romance, which never ended.
In 1951, after an intense courtship, Evelyn married Edward Hooker in London.
We were at a cocktail party given us by the dean in honor of our marriage after we came home from being married in London. And this wife of one of the other professors came up to Edward and she said, "Edward," she said, "I hear that you've married your psychiatrist." And he said, It's worse than that, Josie." He said, "I married my tenant and did myself out of the rent."
Evelyn's friendships with gay men continued to flourish. In the mid-50s, Christopher Isherwood, who was even then openly gay, moved into a renovated studio behind Evelyn's garage on Saltaire. These home movies, taken in Palm Springs by Isherwood's lover, Don Bacardi, show Evelyn with Isherwood, Natasha Spender, Stephen Spender's wife, and Raymond Chandler. However, as Evelyn understood all too well, life for gay people was not always this idyllic.
A new approach to homosexuality occurred, and one that is not a happy picture in the history of psychiatry, and that was aversive therapy, giving a series of graded electric shocks to homosexuals as they viewed pictures that were homosexually erotic, and stopping the shocks only when the subject switched to a heterosexually erotic subject. I went to explore that. I went to a man in Boston who was doing that. I sat in the chair and I said, I want to feel these shocks. I want to see what they're like. And I said, start with a low one. And he started with a low one, and I almost jumped out of my seat. It was a rugged shock. In talking to this man, I discovered some interesting things. The patients controlled their behavior as long as they believed in him and trusted him and felt that the treatment was going to help them. But if they got angry at him for any reason, they immediately reverted back to gay behavior, which indicated that the theory behind this, that presumably they were erasing or eradicating permanently the homosexual impulses, was not true. They were merely being repressed.
Psychologists sought to alter gay sexual orientation by having homosexual men masturbate to heterosexual erotica. In 1952, the APA published the first Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM, which came to be used in the field to diagnose mental illnesses. Homosexuality was termed a sociopathic personality disorder. Working outside the mainstream, psychologists such as Carl Rogers concentrated on helping homosexual patients accept their sexual identity.
Just to use the word is a very loaded word, because when you say that you're queer, it automatically sets you apart. You lose your individuality immediately, and you become one of a horrible group. I mean, they say they're abnormal people, but they're really not. They are, but they aren't. They're perfectly ordinary in every other respect. Although their sexual outlook, of course, colors their outlook on everything else, and they'll be different from other normal people.
But you feel that when you're labeled homosexual, then it's as though you're no longer a person at all. You're
I don't want to. That's why I don't like to use the word, because you lose your name, you lose everything. I mean, it's just...
that label really destroys you as a person and just puts you in a class.
Puts you in a class that's not accepted. It's not balanced.
A primary research organization, the National Institute of Mental Health, or NIMH, was established in Washington, D.C. in 1946.
I had heard that NIMH was now giving grants. I had been looking at this material. I had a lot of material, which I couldn't make any use of it because I didn't have a control group for those people, for the original gay group at all. So I didn't know whether what I was finding with them was simply a very bright, creative group of men, which they were, and that it did not have anything to do with homosexuality. Since I didn't have a control group, I couldn't know. So I said to myself, well, how about it? I think I'll apply to NIMH. You see, I didn't have the idea yet, firmly, that this was a worthwhile thing to do. And I said, I will send a project into NIMH, and if they think it's worth doing, if the study committee looks at it and says it's worth doing, I'll do it. So I sent in the project. The next thing I knew, I have a letter from Dr. John Eberhardt, chief of the Grants Division. He's coming out to spend the day with me. He clearly wants to know what kind of a kook this is who says she wants to study normal homosexuals and who has access to any number of them, she says. At the end of the day, we had a lovely day. At the end of the day, John said, well, I can tell you, we're prepared to make you the grant. He said, you know what it's called back there on the ranch? They call it the Ferry Project. And so I decided that I needed to collect two groups of men. One, a group of exclusively homosexual men, and one, a group of exclusively heterosexual men.
To find subjects for a new study, Evelyn turned to the Mattachine Society, a group founded by Chuck Rowland, Harry Hay, and others to advocate gay rights.
We, meaning the Mattachine, provided, I think, a good part of her subjects. And we met her for the first time in one of the lecture halls at UCLA, a good number of people there. And she was very charming. I remember one of the first questions she asked us was, how many of you had been married? Well, almost every hand went up because we met, these were all gay men. And marriage to us meant gay marriage, see. But she had never heard of that term. She thought we were talking about conventional marriage. So she said, oh dear, I'm not going to be able to use you people. So we finally got that matter straightened out.
Now came the problem of finding predominantly or exclusively heterosexual men to match with them. And it was very difficult. It was very difficult. I went to educational director of labor unions, and I thought, I'll tell them I'm doing the study. It may involve sexuality. You know. Oh, no, we can't touch that, they said. Oh, no, we can't. It might backlash, and then we can't touch that. My husband would say at one point, no man is safe on Solitaire Avenue, because if a laborer came, I was apt to pounce on him and ask him if he would like to be in a research project.
So I talked to her, and I thought it was a good idea, good study. And she asked me to be the guinea pig of her heterosexual control group. So I spent a couple of days. They gave you a Rorschach, they gave you a TAT, they gave you an intelligence test.
Every man who came to me put his occupation, his job, his reputation at stake because of the possibility that he might be followed there and that somebody else might learn his secret, namely that he was gay. So it was indeed a very perilous time. I could not do it at UCLA because nobody would come. They would know immediately that if they simply walked down the hall to my office, that it would be known, oh, that's the Hooker Project, and that's homosexuality. I had to do it in a place far away from prying eyes. My home, it was an acre of garden surrounded by fruit trees and brick walls. Once a person came inside that and walked down the long road to the study, nobody could observe them. This would reassure my subjects as well as give me some peace of mind.
After a year of work, Evelyn presented 60 psychological profiles to a team of 3 expert evaluators. She removed all identifying marks, including sexual orientation.
I would then administer a psychological test, which I'll describe in a moment, psychological tests using, for the interpretation of those tests, the best experts I could find in the country whose capacity to interpret those tests was internationally known, so that I would not be interpreting the tests at all, and therefore not my own bias or prejudice, whatever it might be, would not be involved. First of all, I do the Rorschach, and everybody in this country knows that a Rorschach is an ink blot test, and that what you see in an ink blot test is characteristic of you and not characteristic of the ink blot.
One of these evaluators was Bruno Klopfer of Rorschach test fame.
People said to me, "You mean to tell me you think you're going to be able to fool him?" Fool him, meaning fool him with your facial expression. I said, "Well, I've sometimes been accused of being an actress, and I'll see what I can do."
The evaluators were to rate them on a 5-point scale, 1 being well-adjusted, 5 poorly adjusted.
Almost the same number of gay men and straight men are found in number 1 and in number 3 and in number 5, which means there's no difference in the pathology between the gay men and the straight men.
Klopfer believed he could distinguish gay from non-gay males by studying their Rorschachs. Evelyn challenged him to do so by examining paired homosexual and heterosexual profiles.
Now I have 30 pairs consisting of 1 gay protocol, 1 straight protocol. Bruno's task is to tell me which one is which. This, to me, was one of the most important parts of the test. And he couldn't. He couldn't. He went through the 30 pairs, including the B-men, made a mistake on one, got the other straight, but he couldn't do better than Chance. And if Bruno can't do better than Chance in a projective test, nobody can.
Edwin Schneidman, creator of the MAPS test, also analyzed the 60 profiles.
MAPS is an acronym, stands for Make a Picture Story. It's a thematic projective test in which an individual looks at a picture and tells a story. Now, if you ask a person to tell a series of stories to a series of pictures, that person will tell a great deal about himself, investing needs and sentiments and outlooks and interpersonal preferences and biases and so on. That's what it's like. I can show it to you if you wish. Sure. Make a picture story test. It consists of a set of background pictures. Here's one of them. It's obviously a living room. And it's some 67 figures. There are men, women, boys, girls. Most are dressed, a few are unclothed. The person is then asked to select one or more, put them in the background as they might be in real life, and then tell a story to the situation that's been created. It was from spring to autumn, 6 months or more, in her lovely place on Salt Air. I interpreted the MAPS test records. We did one a setting because this took 2, 3, maybe 4 hours. And we sat outdoors near an apricot tree. I remember it in bloom, the pink and white blossoms. And we actually ate the fruit of that tree before it was all over. I remember a case with Dr. Hooker's materials. I was sailing along, interpreting one of these MAPS test protocols, and there he had done something, given a story to the living room and street and medical and bathroom and dream and bridge, and in the bedroom, I can find it here. Oh, here it is. What he did was to take these 2 male figures and put them in the bed like this. And I suddenly tumbled onto the fact that, in addition to other things, that he had a homosexual sexual orientation. And I remember saying to Dr. Hooker, gee, I wish I could say that I saw it all now, that this was a person with a homosexual orientation, but I don't see it at all, that it's a homosexual scene, but it doesn't change the dynamics of the person up to this point. The results were most interesting. They were fascinating. The expectation was that one would, after you identified the records, you'd have 2 discrete groups. And what was found was that you had 2 highly overlapping groups. Indeed, it was hard to tell them apart.
The 3rd judge, Dr. Mortimer Meyer, now deceased, Mort was absolutely convinced that he could tell. And in fact, when he couldn't, he asked as a special favor if he couldn't come back and go through the process again, because he was so sure that he would be able to do it.
The evaluators agreed that in terms of adjustment, there was no significant difference between the 30 homosexual men and their 30 heterosexual counterparts. none of the experts could beat random chance in identifying on the basis of the paired profiles who was or was not homosexual. In 1956, Evelyn presented the results of her research in a paper delivered to the American Psychological Association's convention in Chicago.
I gave it in a large ballroom in the hotel. It seated about 1,000 people, I think. It was a very exciting time. I would not read a paper which I did not find interesting or exciting, and that sort of communicated itself, I think, to this vast audience. I read that paper for an hour. There was thunderous applause at the end, and then we were bombarded with questions and comments, and they ran the gamut, I must say. They were, well, how can you possibly judge anything from anything as subjective as the Rorschach is concerned? And there must be some mistake in the way in which you selected the subject to statements of great, almost historic pronouncement. This is an historic occasion. It's absolutely extraordinary that we should have had a paper devoted to not just to clinical subjects or patients, but devoted to walking around employed of seemingly well-functioning men.
I think Evelyn's work really provides a model for questioning all sorts of assumptions, things that people have always thought that they knew about human behavior and human sexual behavior specifically. This is a part of human behavior about which psychologists and psychiatrists and other scientists have always carried assumptions and stereotypes that really came more from the culture than from science. And Evelyn provides this wonderful example of stepping back from those assumptions, questioning them, applying the scientific method, and then perhaps finding that those assumptions really don't hold up.
In the 1950s, she took on the field of psychology by using the scientific approach to really question what had really been clinical speculation about a stigmatized population, gay men and lesbians. And using this approach, she really took on the assumptions of the day, took on her colleagues who were sure they could prove her wrong, and changed for generations to come how we approach working with gay men and lesbians.
Those who were most punitive and filled with hatred and stuff, and obviously you're going to have a lot of psychologists like that too, as any other profession. They said it just has to be false. It can't be true.
She wasn't buffaloed by the criticism. She felt that most of the criticism, and she was absolutely right, stemmed from ignorance, you know.
As I moved around the halls of the APA in the following days, person after person would come up to me and say, "What a light that sheds. What a light that sheds."
Before Evelyn's results were published, her friend Sam Fromm died in a car accident. A few years later, her friend Lucy Nixon was also killed in a car crash.
I came back to Los Angeles in September. The following January, my husband died within 1 minute of a heart attack. It was an almost insurmountable grief because, and unthinkable to work, because I, of course, had always thought he would be there. And life without him was, for a long time, empty. I gradually did get back to do some work, especially all those years I had been interested not only in individual personality, but also interested in the gay community.
Evelyn was the first social scientist to publish research on the gay community. Her work inspired others to see this community as a legitimate area for research. In spite of Evelyn's work, the media continued to endorse the view of certain psychoanalysts that it was parental upbringing, and in particular, bad mothering, which caused homosexuality.
Most mothers were involved in an unusually close and over-intimate relationship with this son. He was generally their favorite. She spent a great deal of time with him, and often mothers openly preferred this son to their husband. Although themselves rather puritanical and portraying for the son a concept of maleness and masculinity as brutish and animal-like, they themselves were frequently seductive and engaged in inappropriate bathroom and sleeping arrangements with these sons.
But Mother wouldn't let him go, wouldn't give him the chance to learn for himself. Since then, I've talked a lot with her, now that Jimmy is under treatment with us, and she is beginning to understand how all his life she had been holding him back from healthy contact with the world.
Dr. Socarides' views and Edmund Bergler's in the 50s, where their views of homosexuals, even as sick, were so horrendous that they were people out of control, that they were people who were a danger. Because they were out of control, they were a danger to children and adolescents.
Jimmy played baseball all afternoon, and he didn't feel like walking home, so he decided to thumb a ride. And he didn't think anything was unusual when the driver struck up a friendly conversation. And it only seemed minutes before they pulled up in front of Jimmy's house. Then he told him he'd see him again. Sure enough, the following day, when finished playing ball, well, the man was there waiting. The following Saturday, they went fishing together. By now, they were using first names. Ralph said it was more friendly. Ralph showed him some pornographic pictures. Jimmy knew he shouldn't be interested, but, well, he was curious. What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick, a sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious, a sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual, a person who demands an intimate relationship with members of their own sex.
In the early 60s, using Evelyn's study as ammunition, gay men and lesbians began to speak out.
When I find that I'm pleading with people to look at the evidence, these people are not crazy. They're not abnormal. They're just ordinary people like you and me. And they looked at me as if I ought to have my head examined. I ought to have my head examined. That's what they thought. And I thought, it's going to be a hell of a long time before the laws or the customs change enough to give these people a decent chance at life.
Meanwhile, fame caught up with Evelyn. She was invited to lecture in Europe in 1961.
In Norway, there was a young man who was beginning to do some work on homosexuality, and he was in the Institute of Social Sciences in Oslo. I had been told that he was spastic and that he was truly a remarkable person. I'll meet you at the station, he said. So one day, bright and early, I flew up from Copenhagen to Oslo, and I've never seen a more radiant face in my life. Never. He had this huge dog by him. He told me when he wrote that he had to know exactly what he was going to write, because he couldn't afford to have to write it over, because he writes it with, that's all he has in his hands are these two fingers, and he writes his whole novels that way. He said, you know, I'm not only studying gay people, he said, I'm studying political refugees, because they will teach me the meaning of movement. And I'm studying the blind, because they will teach me how to see. And I am studying homosexuals, he said, because they will teach me how to love. In 1967, after I had been working on research on male homosexuality from 1954, the director of the National Institute of Mental Health asked me to come back to Washington and to discuss with him what the National Institute of Mental Health ought to be doing about homosexuality. And I had gone there with the idea that if possible, I was going to persuade this group of men that we should recommend that NIMH establish a center for the study of sexuality. Not homosexuality, but sexuality, the whole range. Because I had long been convinced that a lot of our understanding of homosexuality was dependent on our understanding of heterosexuality. What we were asked to do was to bring in recommendations to the director of NIMH concerning research which needed to be done. We also decided that it was necessary for us to make some statements concerning the effect of discrimination, job discrimination, housing discrimination on homosexuals.
1969. Johnson gives way to Nixon, and the official publication of the Hooker Report is delayed. Without official authorization, one magazine published the Hooker Report in 1970. It fueled an increasingly activist gay community.
X20.
The report publicly affirmed what many gay people needed to hear, that they were not sick, that their sexuality in no way required the intervention of the psychiatric community.
Behind our self-identity, our passivity of loving women is being called a lesbian.
It recommended that homosexuality be decriminalized and that gay men and lesbians be afforded the same rights guaranteed other Americans. The activism of the 70s brought lesbians increasingly to the attention of researchers. As lesbians became a subject of psychological research, more myths were shattered.
Evelyn really began an important process of networking for gay men and lesbian psychologists. Because we felt free to come out, because we felt that we wanted to continue her pioneering work. Beginning in the early 70s, a variety of networks, organizations within the American Psychological Association and without began to form.
A number of gay colleagues came up to me and invited me to come to their private meetings, which had been organized into what they called the Gay PA. Not the APA, but the Gay PA. And there were a small group of wonderful men who had formed this organization, but were very much in the closet, very fearful of being known and identified by anyone whom they couldn't trust, because many of them were professors in medical schools and had important positions in hospitals and so on. They felt they'd be fired. They probably would have been. We organized a meeting at which a psychiatrist, for the first time, spoke out and said, "I'm gay and I'm a psychiatrist." But he wore a mask and he spoke into a microphone that disguised his voice. There were a number of us who spoke at that meeting and commented about how dreadful it was that a colleague had to do this because we still were in such a backward position.
So you're going to show me your study.
Yes. Well, I don't know if there's very much to show you in here. Books, 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 books. This is all the space I had here, so that I had to give away a lifetime accumulation of journals, for example, including all the gay journals that I had. These awards, I prize them very much. it seemed to me that that this is one way of letting the people who were involved in the research, and their friends and friends and friends, those people could then tell me, that was a good thing you did.
Mm-hmm.
That was a good thing you did. It made a difference in our lives. And that's why these mean as much as they do to me.
Now, where's the rest of your research?
You mean the original document?
The original documents.
It's in that closet.
Oh, it is?
Yeah. But there's so much. All you'll see are filing cabinets. And mind you, if you went to the Kinsey Institute, that's all you'd see too. There are 3 filing cabinets in there. They are the original documents obtained from gay subjects way back in the early 50s. They're jam-packed full, and the probability is that I will buy a shredder and shred it before I die.
Why?
Well,
Don't you think it should be saved or
no,
preserved?
no, I don't. People talk about that, but I don't believe it should be. And the reason I don't think it should be is that, first of all, the test material has been analyzed fully, and there's no point in going over those old grounds. The life histories are there, but they're not conducted in a way in which anybody else could really make sense of them. Partly it's because there was the terrible effort in 54 or 5 to conceal the identity of these men. I think what for me was the unpredictable element was when people like Frank Kameny arose in the Middle West and in Washington and said, we'll have no more of this, and was willing, with his colleagues, to march into psychiatric meetings and say, if you're going to talk about us, we insist that we must have the right to talk too. You must hear us, or you can't simply sit and talk with us. And grabbed microphones, and at first I was a little horrified, and then I thought, well, gee, this is really very good. This is clever. And probably the way that they're really going to get to do what they really want to do.
Armed with Dr. Hooker's study and others that corroborated it, in 1974, gay rights advocates and enlightened psychiatrists sought to expunge from the DSM the classification of homosexuality as a mental illness.
The Board of Trustees of the American Psychiatric Association, after almost 2 years of debate and study of the issues, scientifically, to the best of their ability and our ability, voted to remove homosexuality as an illness from the DSM-3. And that was a historic change and had great impact on the legal status of gay men and women in this country, and I think still does.
Let me ask you both what your reaction is to this referendum decision.
I think it clears away the underbrush and the clutter and allows us to get at the real problems that are facing us as homosexuals, both in terms of our relationships to the general community, prejudice, the need for an elimination of it, the need for legal changes, the institution of civil rights laws. And this will eliminate the self-contempt and the self-hatred which society imposes upon all minority groups, ours included, and permit us to hold up our heads in pride.
People fear what they don't understand. And I think it makes an enormous difference as you begin to really know better. The whole purpose of science is to know what is unknown. And the great significance of Evelyn's work is that she started a scientific movement towards understanding gay men and women better.
At the age of 63, Evelyn decided that she had succeeded in what she and Sam Fromm had set out to do, and she retired from her research.
I opened an office for the private practice of psychotherapy. And of course, who were my patients? Lesbians and gay men. Who else?
She undid the old approaches that said we had to cure people and laid the groundwork for approaches that said, let's find ways to make people feel and enhance the functioning of people that are gay and lesbian. And as a result, there's been approaches now that have as its premise that being gay or lesbian is a capacity, an ability, not a disability, that many people can be very happy living a gay or lesbian life, and that part of the approach is helping people come out, feel comfortable with who they are, and learn ways to manage the remaining stigma and prejudice that still exists in society outside.
I think that Evelyn has almost a mythic status among younger psychologists and younger scientists because the work that she did was so important. It was so pioneering. You know, today it's still difficult to do this research at times. It's still not always approved of. But we all know that it's much easier today than it was in the 50s when Evelyn did it. And I think that we all have a tremendous amount of respect for her for that reason and really do look to her as a model, as someone to emulate, someone whom we would like to be like.
Remember, I was a very serious scientist, and if I had thought that any part of that was going to end up with me in a limousine going to the Century Plaza Hotel, I would have said, "You're out of your living minds, and I want nothing to do with it."
On behalf of the Gay and Lesbian Community Services Center, we would like to thank you for your work, which has improved our lives as gays and lesbians. Thank you.
Thank you. That's beautiful. I remember once when I was very, very young, 20 maybe, I fell in love for the first time. You see, when you get to be 82, you can talk about love. And I fell in love for the first time. Well, I was a graduate student at the University of Colorado. The man with whom I fell in love was a professor, not Chinese, a professor at Yangqing University in China. I knew that I would never see him again if he was going back to China. I could deal with that somehow. But then one day, I was walking along the street in Boulder and happened to encounter our landlady of the preceding summer. And she said, "I suppose you know that Dr. Selden Spencer is dead." I not only did not know, but I also felt at that moment that something had put a dagger straight through my whole being. So for 3 days, I walked the streets of that campus. And finally, my beloved senior professor called me in and said, "I think I have the right to ask you, there's something terribly wrong. What is it?" "You can tell me," I think. He'd asked me to write my autobiography for him before that. And so I told him, and I said, with great anger, and I said, "I will never fall in love again. It's too painful." And he said, "That's not the lesson you learn. The lesson you learn is you're very lucky if you fall in love even once or twice. But very often there is a price to be paid." So the knowledge that you have in your beings an extraordinary capacity to give love if you learn how. With that, I'll stop.